evidence. Christ indicated in the story of the doubting Thomas that he didn't expect there was any evidence other than his letting Thomas perhaps probe his wounds in his hand and or shove his hand, depending on whether you're Protestant or Catholic, into the side of his mortal wound, that there was any more evidence that Christians would be blessed based on their ability to believe based on nothing, why are you providing evidence of his resurrection?
All right, let's try to understand this question. This is actually a theological question. It doesn't call into question any of the historical facts that I presented tonight, the burial, the empty tomb, the appearances, and so forth, nor does it attempt to show that the resurrection of Jesus is not the best explanation of these facts based on criteria like explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility, and so forth. Rather, this is a theological objection. It's saying if Jesus and John, who records the Doubting Thomas story, thought that evidence isn't important for belief in Jesus' resurrection, then why do something like what I've done tonight? Well, I think that this is based upon a misunderstanding of the Thomas story. Let me just read that account to you. Thomas, one of the 12, named Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. So Thomas wasn't with the others when Jesus appeared to them in the upper room. The other disciples, therefore, were saying to him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the imprint of the nails, and put my finger into the place of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." And after 8 days, again the disciples were inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors having been shut, and stood in their midst, and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Reach here your finger, and see my hands, and reach here your hand, and put it in my side, and be not unbelieving, but believing." Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Because you have seen me, have you believed? Blessed are they who did not see and yet believed." Now, the questioner is suggesting what this is saying is that it's more blessed to just believe in the resurrection of Jesus on faith or something without seeing than to require evidence. But is that the correct interpretation of the story? No, this gentleman shaking his head, no. What Thomas refused to do was to believe the apostolic testimony to the resurrection of Jesus. The disciples had seen the Lord, and they bore testimony to what they had seen and experienced. And Thomas was refusing to believe the eyewitness testimony to the resurrection of Jesus. And John is saying to the readers of his day, don't be skeptical. You yourself haven't seen an appearance of Jesus. Jesus doesn't appear to every person in every age. You haven't seen him. But you have the apostolic eyewitness testimony to this event, and you should believe on that basis. And so right after the story, he goes on to say, "Many other signs, therefore, Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and the believing you may have life in his name." So John is saying these signs are recorded. We have the eyewitness apostolic testimony to these miraculous signs, and therefore you are blessed if you believe this apostolic testimony to these signs, even if you yourself has not personally seen the empty tomb or witnessed a resurrection appearance of Jesus. So far from undermining the historical evidence for the resurrection, I think this story actually augments the importance of examining the apostolic testimony to the resurrection, and if it is trustworthy and believable, believing on that basis rather than saying, well, why doesn't he appear to me in my bedroom? That John says is an unreasonable demand.